London. He's a registered social worker with practice experience in the NHS and residential social care as well. His interests include social interventions in mental health, and community alternatives to mental health inpatient care. He's co-director of the NIHR Mental Health Policy Research Unit and the BRC Loneliness and Social Isolation in Mental Health Research Network. And it's also a good collaborator of mine as well. So it's great to see you. So I'll hand over to you, Bryn. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect, yeah. Okay, hi everybody, hi, thanks very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. It still feels like quite a privilege to be back at these face-to-face events, doesn't it? And I'm looking forward to a really fascinating day. So I'm not at the point in a study at the moment where it's ended and I've got results to share. So rather than focus in depth on any one study, I'm going to try over the next 20 minutes or so to give a really brief overview of where I think we're at in terms of kind of research with mental health and loneliness, and then briefly introduce 3 projects that I'm working on currently. They're an attempt to add something to the knowledge base and think about what we can do to help in this area. So if I'm skating over quite a lot of ground quite rapidly in this talk, apologies, but I'd be delighted to talk to any of you more about this afterwards or in the tea break or whatever, or hear about any related work you're doing. So in the research group I'm part of at UCL, we've been increasingly interested in loneliness in mental health contexts for sort of 6 or 7 years probably now. But we're not alone in that. So everyone's interested in loneliness now, right? Isn't it? It's a thing that's been discovered over the last 10 years or rediscovered. And I think there's a kind of growing recognition in policy and nationally and in the media and so on about kind of both that loneliness, making meaningful social connections is quite difficult in our modern world, and that loneliness is really important for people's well-being and mental health. And I've already seen one of the early posters that was put up this morning was talking about social connection as a protective factor and the lack of it as a risk factor for suicide. So we know that this is important stuff for protecting people's mental health, right? So just to be clear, kind of what we're talking about in a sort of, this is the research definition of loneliness that gets trotted out most commonly by Pullman and Peplau from 1981. So loneliness is this negative emotional state resulting from a discrepancy between the social relationships you've got and the social relationships you'd like. So that immediately locates it as a subjective experience, and actually what constitutes a good set of social relationships will not be the same for everybody. Loneliness isn't the same thing as low mood, so you can be depressed but not lonely, you can be lonely but not depressed, but they are moderately correlated. And loneliness isn't the same thing as the amount of social contact you have either. So I think we all know happy loners in life who get on fairly well with fairly limited social interaction with others, and probably most of us have had the experience of feeling lonely in a crowd at times as well. But interestingly, I think loneliness and subjective social isolation tends to be a stronger predictor or more strongly associated with mental health outcomes than the amount of social contact or objective social isolation. So we're looking about where we should be targeting to help people and to intervene in mental health. Possibly loneliness and subjective experience of isolation are a good bet. So what do we know about loneliness among people with mental health difficulties? Well, we know it's common. So I think your chances of being lonely are tenfold greater if you're depressed than if you're not depressed. And likewise, high levels of loneliness in other conditions as well. There's been most research done about common mental disorders and loneliness. So we know that if you're lonely, that's a risk factor for the onset of depression. If you're depressed and you're also lonely, your chances of making a full and swift recovery are less good than if you're not also lonely. There's a less kind of well-established evidence base for other conditions, but the trends are the same, really, that there's this link between illness severity and loneliness. So chances are that loneliness is not good news for your mental health. And if we could do something to help people with their loneliness, we might improve people's mental health outcomes. The Cachopos are a kind of power couple of loneliness research. They've done a load of great work in America, and they, including looking at kind of conceptualizing loneliness. And they've got this model with these 3 domains, which I find is a really helpful one for thinking about different experiences of loneliness and also how we might help people. So collective loneliness is feeling like you belong and you're welcome in your neighborhood and your society. Relational loneliness is having people to do stuff with, really, so having friends or people to pursue your interests with. And intimate loneliness is having somebody or people around you who really get you, who love you, who you can confide in, a love or an intimate relationship, all of those aspects of life. So what might we do? If I've kind of hopefully persuaded you that loneliness is a thing, we can measure it with kind of validated scales. We think that it might be important for mental health, and helping people with mental health difficulties with loneliness could be important. How might we help? So there's a load of work going on in this, and this is a model from Pam Qualter, who's a fantastic researcher in Manchester, who's done a lot of work about sort of really psychological formulations of loneliness in mental health. And this is a nice model she's made, which talks about sort of heightened threat perceptions and then social withdrawal and failure to disconfirm your negative beliefs about social interactions and so on, driving loneliness. So plenty of kind of psychological approaches to dealing with loneliness. Also more socially focused approaches. So social prescribing is something you might be offered from primary care, really just to in a more sort of straightforward way, perhaps, to try and link you in with stuff that's available in your local community that you might not be aware of, or might not quite have the kind of courage or the oomph on your own to go and connect with. So social prescribers are doing great work in that area. And what do we know about what helps and what works with addressing loneliness? Well, I think the good news is in the general population, a load of stuff helps with loneliness. Obviously, not everyone needs intervention. For a lot of people, loneliness is a sort of transient state that will resolve itself as your life moves on. But for people who are having long-term loneliness, a lot of things can help, really. So both psychological and a range of social approaches, quite a number of trials. We don't really yet have a kind of definitive answer to what are the most effective approaches. So the two reviews I've got there, Eccles and Foucault, looking at young people and older people respectively, said we can't definitively say this type of approach is better, but a load of things seem to work. But what we know an awful lot less about, and the area that I'm really interested in working in, is about what helps with loneliness for people with more severe mental health difficulties. So people, for instance, using specialist mental health services. And I've quoted three reviews there, Mann, Marr and Barnett, which basically come up with the same conclusion that we don't know. There's not many trials in the first place. A lot of the trials there are with serious mental health, people with serious mental health difficulties are either very small or sort of feasibility trials, have negative results. So we don't have a lot to go on in terms of what we know works. And I think we should be careful about concluding that things that work in the general population are necessarily going to help people with more severe mental health difficulties for a number of reasons. That I think for a starting point, people are starting often from a more difficult base if you've got a severe mental health problem. That most of us, if we want to go and do something new, go to some new group or activity, we might try and take a friend with us to make it all a bit less scary and a more fun experience. If you haven't got that friend in the first place because you're starting with a small social network, those things are really difficult. People can lose their social identities and sense of themselves through a long period of illness, and people's confidence may well be shot, and sort of just re-engaging with everything and taking those first steps can be really difficult. We know societal stigma is a real thing. So if you do take the plunge and go and try some sort of new group or activity or try to connect with new people, you may or may not get a warm welcome if people know you've got a mental health difficulty. And there are all these kind of concomitant social problems that are obviously important, that if you've got a low income, for instance, then going off and doing new things and reconnecting with others may be more challenging. So we may need, if not specialist new types of support for people with mental health difficulties, we at least need to evaluate interventions for loneliness among mental health populations to see what works for whom in this area. And what might we need? Well, I guess these three women on the slide here are kind of an example, really, that there might very well not be one size that fits all for kind of how we help with loneliness. So these three people might all score the same on a loneliness scale. So they might look like they've got similar difficulties, but the experiences of an older adult who potentially has lost their life partner and has got physical mobility difficulties, of a new parent who's never alone, but might not have people they can talk to sort of about or confide in day to day, and may have lost some identities through parenthood, or a trans woman facing kind of discrimination in society, might all have very different needs. So actually what's driving loneliness and what types of support might be helpful could be quite different for people. So I would conclude from that that either we're going to need a suite of different types of support so that we can try and offer different things for different people and work out what works for whom, or at the very least, we kind of need a model of support for loneliness which is flexible. So it's not just a manual, this is what you get, but can be delivered flexibly to be tailored for people's individual needs and circumstances. And I think what we know at the moment is that there's not all that much of this happening in practice. So apologies if you're working in the service and doing great work out there. There are certainly interesting things going on, but generally in mental health, people using services say they get less help with social relationships, loneliness, making connections with others than they would like. And it's not even talked about as much, let alone sort of active support. And I've got a lot of sympathy with services and practitioners in this, because there's certainly not an evidence base to guide people. You know, you're not going to find a lot in nice guidelines about loneliness interventions or kind of clear models that people can use. But I think we just know, don't we, intuitively, how important social connections are for all of us in our lives and for our well-being and health and recovery from difficult times. And the drift in the last 20 years has been very much to sort of move away from a very narrow clinical definition of what mental health care should be about. So recovery and the point of services is not just to leave people symptom free, right? It's to leave people living good and meaningful lives which are fulfilling. So if we're serious about that and we really want to sort of support personal recovery and have person-centered care, then we've got to be doing something about social relationships and loneliness. And I think that's the challenge really for us as researchers, to try and help services think, well, what can be done really, and what might be good types of support that could help people. So that's kind of my pitch really about what we know in loneliness, what there is still to do, and why it's important. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is just briefly sort of introduce 3 bits of work I'm working on, which are 3 kind of examples among the range of stuff that's going on out there at the moment. This is an expanding field about what we might do to expand the knowledge base and to help. So I'm going to talk first about a big randomized controlled trial I've got going on, the Community Navigators trial, and then 2 more kind of developing intervention studies, the sushi study and the car study. So I had lots of fun trying to choose the best graphics I could there. And just to say, in all of these are collaborations. I haven't name checked everyone I'm working with, but huge teams in all these studies. And one of the sort of really useful and enriching and helpful bits has been working with colleagues with lived experience on all these studies. So we have co-production groups, often working with practitioners, people using services and academics together, and co-applicants with lived experience on the studies too. And I think probably preaching to the converted here about this is important in all mental health research, right? But I think especially in a topic like loneliness, where we're at an early stage of developing new models of support, really. And so trying to work out what might be acceptable and helpful. You can avoid a lot of pitfalls by just talking to some people who might be using services on the receiving end early to think about what could work well. And I think loneliness as a topic is not something that's kind of highly technical and comes from academic or clinical expertise. So sort of having a lived experience perspective to help with that is pretty crucial. So Community Navigators, this is probably the biggest single thing I'm working on at the moment. It's an HTA trial of the Community Navigator program. And this is a program designed to be an addition for standard care in secondary mental health services, so kind of community mental health teams for people using care, to see whether it kind of adds value to the standard care on offer. And community navigators are new staff who are kind of parachuted into services with a brief just to help people with social relationships and social connections. So they don't have to do all the other stuff that mental health staff do. They focus on this. And what a community navigator will offer somebody is up to 10 one-to-one sessions over 6 months, plus some group meetups with other people using the program, plus a bit of financial support to help with social connections. They've got a budget they can access to try and help people with making social connections and reducing loneliness. And it kind of fits into 3 stages, I guess. So they'll try and get to know the person, the people, places and activities that are important to them, perhaps stuff the person used to do before they got on well, or social relationships they've lost touch with and might want to reconnect with, new stuff they might like to try, and so on. Then they'll help the person set some goals for what they want to do to improve social connections. And hopefully in this program, which is a kind of souped up version of high intensity social prescribing in many ways, really, they've still got some time left to actively support people to achieve those goals. So that might be information finding about places to go, stuff that's on locally. It might be emotional support to actually get there for the first time, or it might be sort of picking somebody up and reframing something that hasn't gone as well as hoped and sort of resetting goals from there. And I think two things that are key about our community navigators is, one is that they are staff coming in with this exclusive ring fence defined role. So they're not having to try and fit this in to be one more task among all the other things they have to do, like mental health staff working more generally would have to. And secondly, they're certainly not necessarily clinically qualified. They're coming hopefully with different expertise, which is really knowing their local community and having some experience of helping people with social participation. And some of our navigators have come from kind of arts or sport-based projects as well as more mental health specific roles. Just to acknowledge as well, we've been using a kind of mapping technique that is based on great work by the McPin Foundation, which is a service user research organisation in terms of visually mapping people, places and activities, and that's been pretty helpful for getting to know somebody. We completed a few years back a feasibility trial, which was really promising and at least showed, I think, that people like this, they take part in it and stick with it, and we could do a trial. So we've now got funding for a big study, which is really to try and determine whether this is an effective programme of support in addition to standard care. And we're running a trial at the moment funded by the HTA programme in 6 mental health trusts in England, so in London, in Birmingham and in Yorkshire. We've got to recruit 300 odd people into the trial, and we're just under, well, I know exactly where we are, but I live by our recruitment numbers, but we're about 2/3 of the way through there. We're recruiting at the moment, and we'll follow people up for a year to see how they do. We're focusing on a population of people with treatment-resistant depression, so that doesn't have to be a primary diagnosis of depression, but it's people who are currently depressed, who have tried antidepressants without full success in teens. The next trial of this works would be with people with more severe mental health difficulties like psychosis and bipolar disorder. And we should know the results of this in a couple of years, so possibly that could be my ticket back here with a bit of luck. Protocol's out as well. This got published a couple of weeks back, so you can check out what we're doing in the trial in more detail if you would like. Okay, that's study number 1. How am I doing? Am I all right for time? Yeah, good. Okay, so second one I'm going to talk to you about is the sushi, just to get you hungry for the break. So the sushi study is a wider study which was focusing on helping people with social inclusion, but as I'll come on to, sort of loneliness and social relationships were a big part of that. And what we were trying to do in this study was to build on some previous work that I was part of, led by a colleague, Jill Mezzi from St George's, where we developed and validated a research measure really of social inclusion that was quite detailed. It had sort of 46 questions asking people about a whole range of areas of life. So worries about crime, whether people were registered to vote, needs for debt support, social relationships, housing, the lot really. And it asked where people kind of how involved in society people were, but also where people would like to be more included than not. So you got some sense of people's priorities for where they wanted to be more socially included. And in Sushi, we tried to turn this into an online tool that could be useful in practice. So to have a sort of web-based questionnaire that practitioners could complete with a service user. And we've tried it in supported accommodation services, which I think is a really interesting sector. And I'm interested in it from a sort of social work, social care perspective. But in supported housing, the staff, there's massive turnover. People come in, they don't get a lot of training often, but they're spending a ton of time with quite vulnerable service users, often over years, months and years. So they're potentially really well placed to support people and with some of these sort of social activities in particular. And I think kind of what we try to do with our online tool is we try quite hard to make it accessible to everybody. So we're only collecting anonymized data, and it's the staff and the service user who keep the ID and know who it is. And we've got a platform that can work on Android and Apple and on phones and on laptops. So potentially a staff member or the person themselves could do it on their own mobile if they need be. But I'll be really interested to hear the talks coming up on digital social inclusion, really, because I think that's a challenge, isn't it, for anything online. So we made this tool. We tried it out with supported accommodation staff and service users, first of all, just in theory, and then actually using it in practice and got some feedback. And I think this is just a slide to show how it works. So you register and then you get this list of your assessment of the areas where somebody said they'd like to be more included. and then they're prompted to pick 3 together with the staff member that they're going to work on in care planning. So it's a kind of nudge to get social inclusion needs into care plans, really. And I think this can hopefully be useful on an individual level, but if services start using it and you're getting a lot of data in from a lot of service users, it's potentially really helpful on an organizational level as well. So you kind of, where people would like to be more included is kind of people's needs. The ones that are prioritized for care planning are met needs, and the other ones are kind of unmet needs, really, that are not being addressed in services. And I wasn't entirely surprised to find from the data we did get in, which was just from Islington, so it's one London borough, it might not be representative, but 2 things that were commonly identified by service users as something they'd like help with, but were rarely prioritized with staff as something to work on together, were help with loneliness and help with finding a partner. So social relationships, loneliness, right, is a key thing which isn't addressed enough in services. We've currently got some plans, not funded yet, but to try and embed using this online questionnaire in a social prescribing service with colleagues in Northern Ireland. And I'll be really interested if we can get some money to try that out. We'll see whether it's useful or not. And the last study, this was a sort of spin-off from this findings from Sushi, really, about help with finding a relationship in particular. And we talked to some of the staff and service users in supported accommodation about why does this never make it to the list of stuff you're going to help with? And service users were a bit unsure about whether they could ask for help with this or how staff might help them. Staff had quite a lot of reservations about, was this their job? May they do this? And if they were allowed to, how could they help people? So I think this is kind of something, and more generally, when I look at what's going on in loneliness research, it's not talking about how to help people find relationships, really. It's talking about feeling connected in your community, joining groups, new activities. And I think this is something that gets overlooked, but it's just a really huge human need, isn't it? For most of us, a massive part of feeling we belong and are not lonely might be having a relationship. A lot of people are single in mental health services. A lot of people might like a relationship or a different sort of relationship from the one they have. And I think this is an area where mental health care has a bit of a blind spot, really. So other client groups do a ton more on this. And there's, for instance, in intellectual disabilities, there's some fantastic work. The Supported Loving website is really worth checking out, I think. And people that in those sectors recognize that helping people meet their needs and wishes for romantic relationships could be part of care, but we don't really in mental health. And I'm really interested to know why not and what might be done about that. So we have a tiny bit of funding from the School for Social Care Research to do some interviews with staff in the first instance, to really ask people a bit about what do you do? Do you ever have these conversations? If so, when and how? What are the barriers? What types of support could you offer people, do you think? And I think we'll go from there. And Liz and I and others are kind of hatching plans to do some further work in this area. So that could be my next invitation, but one with a bit of luck to come back here. So I'm going to wrap up there, I think, just to conclude, really. We know that loneliness is really common for people with mental health difficulties. And I think it's a really exciting area to be thinking about because it's offering a different target for helping people and improving people's mental health outcomes as well as loneliness. It's not another new pill. It's not another wave of CBT. It's something really different that we can offer that is under-provided in services generally at the moment. And that's at least in part because we don't have the research evidence about how to do this effectively and how to help people. So that's our challenge as researchers, and anybody starting their research career thinking where they might want to go. I think social relationships and loneliness is a great area to go in where there's a lot more we don't know than that we do, and there's work to be done. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bryn. And you know that I'm a big fan of the idea of trying to support people in their intimate relationships as well. So look forward to seeing what comes of all of that. So we've got a bit of time for some questions from the room, and we've got a mic. I've got a mic, and we'll do a bit of a roving mic. So if anyone wants to ask a question, I'll do a bit of a run around. I feel like I'm a quiz show host. Hang on.
Thanks. Bryn, one of the things that a lot of people say to me is that the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, are people that are causing the loneliness because people daren't go out of their houses in case they're spotted by someone. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's not something I've heard from people actually, but I'm interested to talk more to people to see. I mean, I really think that kind of lack of money is a barrier to kind of making any social connections really, and especially if you kind of might have physical mobility needs or just be so anxious you want to get a cab somewhere. That's the sort of thing that people are using money from in our study. I think there's lots to say about the malign influence of the benefit system on people with mental health problems, but
yeah, could I just add that we set up the Mad Jam in Edinburgh, and basically when we said what day of the week, they said, well, don't make it during a weekday because the DWP will spot us. So it had to be on Saturday.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question or comment? Oh. Thanks.
Good morning. So I would really like to appreciate your research on loneliness, which is somehow impacting for each and every one of us in some point of our lives. So just directly getting to the question. So have you ever conducted like comparative studies of loneliness in different cultures? Like for example, in Asia or maybe in Africa or in Australia, like different cultures, because sometimes loneliness can also depends on the culture and the community support, like you might already know that. So my question is, have you conducted like comparative study between the UK and maybe Asia or Australia or Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question with a lot going on in it really, and I think it is really important. So like in many areas of research, most of the papers that get published are from high income countries, and I think we know more about that rather than the rest of the world. And I think it is a good question because this is kind of a culturally experienced thing, right, isn't it? And I think even in just about how we've conceptualized social relationships in the UK, we've moved from a kind of talking about social inclusion or social support, which kind of put the locus more in the community, to loneliness, which locates it more with the individual. I think what we know in the UK research, which is where I'm a bit better informed than globally, actually loneliness seems to be pretty common across ethnic groups, across gender. Really, it's a pretty universal thing, but I think there's a lot more to do there, and which we could then learn from what might help as well, really. Yeah.
Hi, it's a human right to have family life and maybe a social life. And so I really appreciate what you're trying to do here. So what do you think about, for example, a husband and wife, and one of them is sectioned and the one that isn't sectioned is banned from visiting? And also I know many mothers that I could name. I could sit here and tell you their son's name and where they are and how long they've been there, and the mothers aren't allowed to visit. What's your view on that, given it's a human right to see your family?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for any type of family relationship, obviously that's a terribly difficult situation where services should be trying to do all they can to support people being able to keep those connections and to see each other, because like you say, it's a fundamental human thing, isn't it, really? Yeah.
Oh, there's... Sorry.
Thank you. I've been trying to formulate my thought into a question and I haven't managed it. So if I could just say something, I'd be interested to hear your retort. The main reason why people give up psychotropic mental health prescriptions is because of their sexual side effects. Antipsychotics and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicines are all likely to ruin your libido and impair your capacity to have an orgasm. And I just wondered how that nested with your final thoughts that impressed me there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And I just think back to when I worked in practice, I went on a training course to use the LUMSs, the side effect schedule thing. And after I'd used that with people, I realized how common it was for people to have sort of difficulties with their sexual lives, which I'd never asked about and it hadn't come up in conversation. And so, so I really get that that's important, and it's one sort of barrier, isn't it, to developing relationships, and one thing that just, if you're lacking confidence anyway, and you've got a lot on your plate dealing with your own mental health, and that's one more thing that just makes it feel difficult, and one reason why people might need support, and support either to think about, you know, kind of obviously what you can do about the medication about that, but also then how you approach that with any partner as well, really. And I think one thing I'm conscious of at the moment is I just haven't talked to enough people using services to hear from them really, and I think we really need to know more about what people would find useful and acceptable in terms of support. It's very early days in this area for me, certainly.
Thank you. Right, we've got another question.
Hi, sorry. Thank you very much for your very insightful talk about loneliness. So I am, sorry, it's a mover. Okay. I try to project a little. I am a solitude researcher, and I am just wondering, like, your opinion about the relationship between solitude and loneliness, especially what my research tends to look into the negative portrayal of solitude or being alone that is quite widespread in society, and also the dynamics between the sense of loneliness and also the concept of loneliness, which is the psychological needs of like being alone, not being fulfilled, as compared to unmet social need in loneliness. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think you're making a really good and important distinction, aren't you? That kind of either periods of solitude or limited social contact in your life is not inherently a problem, is it? That's not necessarily a difficult thing for people. And what I liked about that definition I put up was that it is the negative emotional state that results for some people from a kind of lack of either quality or quantity of social relationships. So I absolutely agree that I don't think services should be getting to a point of kind of trying to see how much social contact people have got and then forcing loneliness interventions on everybody, whether or not they want it. I'm also aware of kind of literature about people's experiences of social contact and loneliness with psychosis. And people talk about a kind of paradox, really, or competing demands of wanting some withdrawal and safe space where you can kind of be with yourself and not stressed, versus wanting social contact. So solitude absolutely has positives. And I think there's a kind of how we frame that might be, again, thinking about kind of cultural formulations of loneliness, how we frame positive experiences of solitude could be pretty helpful and part of the answer to things as well.
Right, we've got one more question, I think.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously had a massive kind of impact on loneliness, and there was increasing feelings of loneliness among all age groups. What do you think the role of digital support systems for loneliness and cross-country, like chat rooms and different forms of digital communication, and their impacts on loneliness?
Yeah, thank you. Another great question, and I hope we'll kind of potentially touch on that more after the break as well. So I think this is, you know, what interventions look like can vary hugely, aren't they? But where digital forms of support and ways of connecting with people have got some great advantages, at least, well, here's two big ones really. One about finding your community, which might not be around you locally, you know, kind of so you can find people who you feel you belong and you fit with, potentially online, if you haven't got access to them in your immediate area. And second is just geography, really, isn't it? And people who are either kind of got limited mobility, or if there's poor bus routes or whatever in your area, then actually having another way to connect with people is obviously helpful. So what our community navigators try to do is a kind of individualized and blended approach. So for some people, they're supporting most of the contact people might want is online, either because of mobility or because it's a bit less scary initially. You've got somewhere withdrawing when you want, and for other people, they very much want to get out there and meet people in real life. And it's not a competition, is it really? They're all part of a solution for sure.
Okay, I think we'll we've got a question online. Okay, shall I read it out? Okay, so this is a question online. I'm curious how you address loneliness issues due to childhood attachment issues, which isn't so much about meeting people, but being able to let them in. So
Yeah.
Interesting question about wanting to connect, but also that barrier emotionally to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And I've got a colleague at UCL, Sarah Riktabi, doing a PhD looking at loneliness among people who have been given a personality disorder diagnosis, and that's coming up quite strongly in her work. Really, that just feeling of not quite being able to connect or never quite feeling like you fit, really. So I suppose there are two ways of going about that, aren't there? Which comes back to this kind of psychological or social approaches, really. Either you try and work on people's cognitions and sense of themselves so that they can go out into the world and perhaps interact differently, or you try and expose people to more welcoming social environments in the hope that that will change how people think about themselves and the world. And I think both of those are plausible ways of doing it, really, and we still don't know what might work best. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bryn, for your very interesting talk. So, shall I swap with you? So we've got our next, I'd just like to introduce our next speakers for before the break. It's Stephanie Allen, Leonie Richardson and Ellie Piri, who are coming to talk to us about the PPI involvement and learning experiences from the Avatar 2 study. The Avatar 2 study is a really exciting trial which is about use of avatars for people to have enter dialogue with their auditory hallucinations as well. So I'll